The intrinsic pathway of coagulation, otherwise known as the contact activation pathway, is one of the two pathways used to eventually form a blood clot. Memorizing this pathway and all of the factor numbers like factor 12, factor 11, 9, 8, and insert seemingly random numbers here can be absolutely dreadful. I'm serious, it's terrible. But relax! After watching this video, I promise you'll have this intrinsic pathway memorized for life. Let's get started. It's lunchtime inside the cafeteria, and for dessert today, we obviously have Jell-O, since these indoor cafeterias always serve Jell-O on the buffet line, right? Anyways, the indoor setting here should remind you of the intrinsic pathway, since intrinsic refers to something coming from inside or within. And the red Jell-O, well, that's our symbol for coagulation, since Jell-O is formed by the clumping together of red liquid, which is kind of like how red blood clots in your body, right? And if we put all this together, this indoors Jell-O is our memory anchor for the intrinsic pathway for coagulation, since Jell-O is formed by the clumping together of red liquid, which is kind of like how red blood clots in your body, right? And if we put all this together, this indoors Jell-O is our memory anchor for the intrinsic pathway for coagulation. To review, the coagulation pathways refer to a series of steps used to make a stable blood clot, a process also known as secondary hemostasis, since this occurs after the formation of a platelet plug, which is obviously known as primary hemostasis. Focusing on the blood clot formation, there are actually two distinct pathways to start the formation of a blood clot. These two different initiating pathways are known as the extrinsic and the intrinsic pathways of coagulation. Both of these two pathways later converge into a common set of ending steps known as the common pathway of coagulation. For this video, we're going to focus only on the intrinsic pathway, named since it depends on factors originating from inside the blood vessel, kind of like how we're inside here, right? To start, take note of the person bumping into the plates for the buffet line on the left. This person is bumping into or making contact with the plates, our symbol for contact activation. You see, the intrinsic pathway is also known as the contact activation pathway for coagulation, since it is initiated by contact with the damaged surface of the blood vessel. The things that kick off this pathway all originate from the inner layers or endothelium on the inside of blood vessels, which is why they are deemed to be intrinsic to blood. Let's cover what things are released when these inner layers of the blood vessel are damaged. Yep, pan over to the college cap that this person is wearing. They must be about to graduate soon, as evidenced by this cap here. Must be getting one last meal here in the cafeteria before the ceremony begins. Anyways, this college cap should help you remember collagen. You know, college for collagen. The exposure of collagen to circulating factors in the blood leads to activation of the intrinsic pathway of coagulation. This collagen is usually found just below the endothelial or inner surface of the blood vessel in what is sometimes known as subendothelial collagen or SEC. Exposure of the blood to this collagen is a sign of vessel injury, leading to activation of the intrinsic pathway for blood clotting. Ah, I see why this person is bumping into the plates now. Turns out that they tripped over that floor covering here. Yep, they cover the floors around the buffet line with this membranous covering to keep things clean here, since the indoor buffet can get kind of messy. Anyways, this floor covering is our symbol for the basement membrane, since the basement membrane is a layer that forms the floor of our endothelium, right? The basement membrane is found right below the endothelial lining of the inner blood vessels and contains the collagen we just discussed, as well as other things. Contact with this basement membrane is another sign of vessel injury that leads to activation of the intrinsic pathway. Next, shift your gaze to the hot plates that got bumped into. You know how the plates of a buffet are always kept hot to sanitize them? Well, these hot plates are here to symbolize activated platelets. You know, since plates are a recurring symbol for platelets, these hot plates are here to symbolize the activation of platelets. Activated platelets are another sign of blood vessel injury that causes the activation of the intrinsic pathway for blood clotting. Next, let's check out that clock on the wall. It's obviously 12 o'clock, the perfect time for lunch at this indoor cafeteria. This clock at 12 is here to help you remember factor 12, the first clotting factor in the intrinsic pathway of coagulation. You see, a damaged vessel surface with collagen or other basement membrane components or activated platelets will then lead to cleavage of factor 12 circulating in the blood. This cleavage actually activates factor 12, thereby serving as the first step of this pathway. Now, because medicine is old, we have eponyms for everything, so there's actually another name for factor 12 you gotta know. Let's cover this next. Since the lunch line can get pretty long, it seems that some students pass the time waiting with a good old game of Wait, Hagaman? Yeah, that's right. This is a game of Hagaman, where you try to guess the letters of a word. Anyways, the Hagaman game here should remind you of the Hagaman factor, the other name for factor 12. Don't ask me why we need to know all of these other names for things. I don't write the test. But in case you see Hagaman factor in the future, you can relax in your masterful knowledge that it's another name for factor 12. So why was the lunch line so long that we needed to play Hagaman to pass the time? Well, as it turns out, our lunch lady by the clock, pointing to 12, is having trouble with swiping his Cap 1 card here. Wait, a Cap 1 card? Isn't that Pixarize's recurring symbol for the C1 complement protein? That's right, so this broken Cap 1 reader is our symbol for something that inhibits C1, otherwise known as C1 esterase inhibitor. You see, activation of factor 12 to start the intrinsic pathway of coagulation is actually blocked by C1 esterase inhibitor, making C1 esterase inhibitor a major regulator of not only the component pathway, but also the intrinsic coagulation pathway. Pretty neat, huh? So what does activated factor 12 do anyways? Well, let's pan over right to one of the kids waiting for our lunch lady to figure out her stuff. Yep, looks like this kid's been waiting so long that he decided to start watching Ocean's 11 while in line. The Ocean's 11 has a deeper meaning here at Pixarize, obviously as our recurring symbol for factor 11. Ocean's 11 for factor 11? Anyways, activated factor 12 works next to cleave factor 11, which activates it, making factor 11 the second member of this pathway. Now, it's worth noting that the Cap 1 card used by our lunch lady actually belongs to the kid here. After all, the lunch lady wouldn't be swiping her own card here, right? This should help you remember that C1 esterase inhibitor also works to inhibit the activation of factor 11. So C1 esterase inhibitor actually works to block both of the first two steps of this pathway, making it a major regulator of the intrinsic pathway. Afterwards, let's check out that screen where our guy trying to stream Ocean's 11 was presented with a copyright C icon. It's copyrighted since pirating content illegally really hurts the people who work around the clock to bring you great content like the video you're watching right now. Okay, I'm getting off my soapbox. But this copyright C should also help you remember hemophilia C. C for, well, hemophilia C. You see, factor 11 is deficient in hemophilia C. This leads to a bleeding disorder that we actually cover in its dedicated video. Just know that factor 11 is impacted by hemophilia C, alright? So what does factor 11 do after it's activated? As it turns out, our guy with the Ocean's 11 wasn't watching his elbow, which bumped right into this unsuspecting kid's headphones, knocking out these 9-volt batteries. The poor guy was just trying to enjoy some lunch when, serendipity hit. Anyways, this 9-volt battery is our symbol for the next member of this pathway, factor 9. 9 volts for factor 9. This stuff really just writes itself sometimes. Anyways, activated factor 11 goes on to cleave factor 9, which, you guessed it, leads to the activation of factor 9. Yes, we did just skip number 10, so it goes straight from factor 11 to factor 9. Now, the activation of factor 9 is kinda special, because it requires a few other things to happen. Let's cover these next. Take a look at the ice cream our poor guy was eating when he happened to get elbowed in the head. With a cow on the label, you bet that this is the world-famous calcium ice cream, which also happens to be our recurring symbol for calcium. And obviously, this is here to help you remember that factor 9 requires calcium ions for its activation. While the details are complicated, the binding of calcium catalyzes the conformation needed to cleave and activate factor 9. But calcium isn't the only thing needed here. If you look at the top of the calcium ice cream, you'll notice that the ice cream is contained under a membrane seal to keep things fresh. This thin membrane covering is our symbol for phospholipids, since phospholipids make up the membranes of our cells, right? And you guessed it, phospholipids, or a membrane surface, is also required for sufficient activation of factor 9. As it turns out, this kid wasn't going to eat this ice cream plain, but instead add some extra crunch by topping it with some Super K cereal. Wait, Super K? Isn't this Pixarize's recurring symbol for vitamin K? Yep, this should help you remember that vitamin K is also required for sufficient activation of factor 9. In fact, factor 9 is one of the vitamin K-dependent clotting factors, which becomes important later when you learn about vitamin K blocking drugs like warfarin. Now, there's a reason you're learning all of this, and it's really because of the headphones this kid is wearing, where the 9-volt battery fell out from. Yep, these are the famous Beats headphones, as evidenced by the letter B decorating the sides. The B here is also our recurring symbol for hemophilia B, which is to help you remember that factor 9, is deficient in hemophilia B, causing bleeding. You should check out our dedicated video on hemophilia to learn more, but for now, I just want you to connect hemophilia B to factor 9. Next, look across the table where this guy's lunchmate seems to be a bit of a superstitious type. He's using a magic 8-ball, perhaps relying on its magic to help him get the big A grade on his upcoming exam. This magic 8-ball is our recurring symbol for factor 8, an 8-ball for factor 8. Pretty easy if you ask me. Factor 8 is the next member of this clotting cascade, but is actually not activated by factor 9. Instead, it's independently activated in the bloodstream. As for what activates factor 8, let's find out next. And just as you might expect from a kid who is studying during lunch, this kid's got some pretty mean buck teeth. Yep, just take a look at these 2 massive buck teeth. These 2 teeth are a recurring symbol for factor 2, also known as thrombin, a downstream clotting factor that actually works here to help activate factor 8. We'll cover factor 2 when we get to our video on the common pathway of coagulation, but the gist is that the downstream factor 2 helps to activate factor 8, creating a sort of positive feedback loop around blood clotting. You want this positive feedback loop to happen since when you get injured, you want to form a clot, and you want to do it pretty fast to stop the bleeding. Now, what big test is our bucktooth kid studying for? For his CS test, of course. That's right, just take a look at the sexy computer science or CS textbook. This CS textbook should remind you of proteins C and S, since CS literally has the letters C and S, right? As it turns out, this kid dropped his heavy CS textbook on his foot, causing him to cry out. The kid being injured by the CS book should help you remember that factor 8 is actually inhibited or blocked by protein C and S. You see, proteins C and S are actually anticoagulation proteins that work to break up clots. And with this mnemonic, now you know that one of the ways they do this is by inhibiting factor 8. Next, notice how this guy has also brought his model cars with him to school. Just as you might expect from a computer science whiz with buck teeth, this guy has only the coolest model cars, made by the famous VWF company. Yep, this is a VWF car, which should help you remember von Willebrand factor, or VWF. In particular, factor 8 is stabilized in the bloodstream by VWF. Without the stabilization of VWF, factor 8 degrades extremely quickly with a short half-life, so the presence of VWF is actually extremely important for maintaining normal levels of factor 8. This relationship is why patients with mild factor 8 deficiency can actually be treated with VWF, a fact we'll cover in a dedicated video on hemophilia A. Speaking of, take a look at our star student's stack of straight A papers. With the grind to study at lunch, this kid deserves nothing less than straight A's. Anyways, his A's here should remind you of hemophilia A, a bleeding disorder caused by a deficiency of factor 8. So there's a few different hemophilias or bleeding disorders, each named after a different letter with a different deficient clotting factor. After watching this video, I'm sure you'll be able to keep all of these guys straight. Finally, it seems that the antics of the 2 kids here have caught the attention of the overseeing teacher, who has run into the cafeteria with his tennis racket. And he's got no ordinary tennis racket, that's a 10 out of 10 rated tennis racket. This 10 out of 10 tennis racket should help you remember factor 10, the next and final member of this pathway. You see, activated factor 9 and factor 8 actually come together to form a complex that then cleaves factor 10 to activate it. This activation of factor 10 is actually the final step of the intrinsic pathway and the first step of the common pathway of coagulation, where the intrinsic and extrinsic pathways meet. You can check out our next video to learn more, but in a nutshell, the activation of factor 10 leads to a series of steps that results in the eventual formation of a blood clot. Finally, let's talk about laboratory monitoring of the intrinsic pathway. Yep, let's swivel back to the potato chips here sold by the lunch lady, since every lunchtime cafeteria has potato chips, right? Anyways, the potato in potato chips should remind you of PTT, since the word potato literally sounds like PTT, right? It's the PTT potato. The potato here should remind you that PTT, short for partial thromboplastin time, is a lab test of clotting time used to monitor the function of the intrinsic pathway of coagulation. In particular, it's important to distinguish the PTT here, that's with the 2 T's, from the PT with just 1 T. which is a totally different lab test used to measure the function of the extrinsic pathway. So PTT with 2 T's measures intrinsic, while PT with 1 T measures extrinsic. You can just remember these potato chips indoors here, and you'll have this under wraps. Alright, that's all for the intrinsic pathway of coagulation. Let's recap. The intrinsic pathway of coagulation, also known as the contact activation pathway, is one of 2 starting pathways that eventually leads to the formation of a blood clot. This pathway is started by the exposure of collagen, basement membrane components, or activated platelets to flowing blood. These are components of the inner layers of blood vessels that usually make contact with blood in the context of a vessel injury. Upon contact with these components, activation of factor 12 or Hagemann factor occurs by way of cleavage. Activated factor 12 then goes into cleave and activate factor 11. Factor 12 and 11 are both inhibited by the actions of C1 esterase inhibitor. Factor 11 specifically is deficient in the bleeding disorder hemophilia C. Next, activated factor 11 goes on to cleave and activate factor 9 in a process that requires calcium ions, phospholipid membranes, and vitamin K. Factor 9 is deficient in hemophilia B, another bleeding disorder caused by insufficient clotting factors. In an independent process, factor 8 is activated by factor 2 in a process that is inhibited by C and S. In particular, factor 8 is stabilized by von Willebrand factor or VWF in the blood. Factor 8 may also be deficient in patients with the bleeding disorder hemophilia A. Next, the activated forms of factor 9 and 8 combine to form a complex that cleaves and activates factor 10, signifying the end of the intrinsic pathway and the beginning of the common pathway of coagulation. Finally, the function of the intrinsic pathway can be monitored by the PTT lab test. And now we're all done with the intrinsic pathway of coagulation. With Pixorize, you can ditch the magic 8 ball and leave getting good grades up to memory and not to pure luck. See you in the next one!